The first scream did not come from a bride. It came from one of the women seated in the front row, a sharp, panic cry that sliced through the garden venue, just as two uniformed security officers pushed through the aisle. Chairs scraped backward. A bouquet hit the ground. The officiant froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open, as if the words had refused to leave him. Guests turned in confusion, some standing, others already pulling out their phones. At the center of the chaos stood Amaka, still, composed, her hands clasped in front of her, while Obi was being pulled away from the altar, his wedding jacket half off his shoulders, his face drained of all color. No one needed an announcement to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. Celeste's relatives reacted first, not with questions but with anger. Voices rose. Accusations flew. One woman lunged forward, pointing at Amaka and shouting that she had come to ruin a blessed union. Another grabbed at Amaka's arm, nails digging into fabric and skin, and the garden erupted into full disorder. Security moved fast, restraining bodies, separating screaming guests, forcing everyone involved to the ground or against the walls. Obi tried to speak, first to Celeste, then to Amaka, but every word collapsed into incoherence. By the time police sirens wailed outside the gate, the ceremony space looked nothing like a wedding. It looked like a crime scene. When the officers arrived, they did not ask who was right. They asked who was involved. Statements were demanded. Evidence was requested. Amaka stepped forward calmly, identifying herself and handing over a prepared folder without shaking hands or raised voice. Obi was handcuffed moments later. Celeste screamed his name. Her relatives protested. Amaka said nothing. As Obi was led away, his eyes locked onto hers, wide, pleading, terrified. It was only then, as the gates closed behind the police vehicle, that the story pulled itself backward, returning to the quiet beginning no one at that venue had seen coming. The previous morning had begun without drama. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as Amaka stood before her mirror, deciding which earrings would suit a simple lunch meeting. She reached instinctively for the sapphire pair she wore, often elegant, familiar, and paused when her fingers touched empty velvet. For a moment, she assumed nothing. She checked the other compartment, then the small travel case she sometimes used. Still nothing. The absence registered not as panic, but as discomfort, like realizing a room sounded different after a clock stopped ticking. She lifted the jewelry box and frowned. It felt lighter. That was when she sat down on the bed. Slowly, deliberately, she began to check each compartment, naming the pieces in her head as if doing inventory for someone else. Emerald necklace, present. Gold bangles, present. Diamond studs, gone. Sapphire set, gone. Vintage necklace, gone. Her breathing changed, shallow and careful, but she did not scream. She stared at the box for a long time, not because she was calm, but because her mind was racing ahead of her emotions, trying to understand how this could have happened. Obi was supposed to be away on a short business trip. That fact floated into her thoughts, unwelcome but unavoidable. Amaka stood, locked the bedroom door, and went to her desk. She opened the folder where she kept certificates, receipts, and photographs. One by one, she matched documents to the empty spaces in the box. The pattern was unmistakable. Only the most valuable pieces were missing. Only the ones that could be sold quickly. By the time she finished, her hands were cold, and the scream finally rose, but she swallowed it. Certainty had arrived, and with it a heavier, quieter resolve. Amaka did not rush to confront anyone. She moved through the house, as if following instructions only she could hear. Her first stop was the safe, concealed behind a false panel Obi himself had installed years earlier, proud of how secure it was. She entered the code and accessed the activity log. The screen told its story without emotion. The safe had been opened 2 nights earlier, long after she had gone to bed. Obi's code. Obi's access. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and Amaka had to sit down again, pressing her palm flat against the floor to steady herself. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to break. Tears came then, hot, angry, disbelieving, but they did not last. When they ended, her face was tight, her eyes clear. She picked up her phone and called her jeweler, keeping her voice neutral, almost casual. She did not accuse. She asked questions. The pause on the other end of the line stretched just long enough to confirm everything. Yes, the pieces had been brought in. Yes, the serial numbers matched. Yes, Obi's name was on the paperwork. Amaka thanked him and requested copies. When the call ended, there was nothing left to doubt. That evening, while the house remained silent, Amaka opened the shared laptop Obi had forgotten to log out of. She searched not for messages, but for confirmations, emails, receipts, bookings. What she found changed everything. A venue. A guest list. A wedding scheduled for the next morning. Bride's name, Celeste. Amaka closed the laptop slowly and sat in the dark for a long time. The story no longer belonged to shock or betrayal. It belonged to preparation. By the time she stood up, she already knew she would not scream tomorrow either. She would arrive with facts, and the noise would come from everyone else. Amaka did not allow the night to swallow her. After she closed the laptop, she returned to the bedroom and switched on every light, not to comfort herself, but to see clearly. She laid a clean wrapper on the bed and placed the jewelry box on it like evidence. Then she began to document what her eyes already knew. She took photographs of each compartment, each empty velvet groove, each missing hook where a chain should have been resting. She opened her file binder and pulled out receipts, warranty cards, valuation papers, and the small laminated certificates that carried serial numbers, so tiny most people never noticed them. She matched each paper to each missing item, writing down dates of purchase, cost, and the last time she personally wore each piece. It was not a sentimental exercise. It was a practical one. She understood, because she had lived long enough to learn, that emotion fades in court, but documentation does not. She checked her bank alerts and card statements with the same cold focus. If Obi sold the jewelry, there would be traces. App transfers, POS charges, deposits, even small withdrawals timed to travel. She found what she could and saved screenshots in a separate folder, naming each file carefully. Diamond Studs receipt, SafeLog access, valuation 2024, Obi flight booking. A part of her wanted to slam the laptop shut and scream into her pillow, but she refused herself the release. Scream now, and she might make the mistake of calling Obi, warning him, giving him time to erase tracks, to craft excuses, to reach Celeste and plan a clean lie. Silence was not weakness. Silence was restraint, controlled, deliberate, dangerous. Before dawn, she expanded the circle of certainty. She opened the insurance policy she had taken years earlier when her mother's necklace became hers. She read the fine print slowly, noting what the company required for claims, proof of ownership, a police report, and any supporting evidence that confirmed theft. She wrote a checklist on paper and ticked items, one by one, as if she were planning a business audit. By the time the sky began to lighten, Amaka's feelings had not disappeared. They had simply been placed behind a locked door inside her, because the work in front of her demanded a clear head. And with every document she arranged, the truth hardened into a single unavoidable conclusion. Obi had not taken jewelry in a moment of desperation. He had planned it. The safe log was the part that angered her the most, not because it shocked her, but because it was so neat. Obi's code, Obi's access, Obi's confidence that the very tool meant to protect her would become the tool that condemned her. Amaka did not simply stare at the record and accept it. She exported it. She printed it. She backed it up to a secure drive. Then she checked the rest of the house, like someone who knew she was living beside an enemy. Doors, windows, the study, the wardrobe. Nothing else looked disturbed. The theft was selective, quiet, and familiar, done by a person who knew exactly what to take and exactly where to find it. That narrowed the list of suspects until there was only one name that mattered. She called the safe company that morning, not to complain, but to confirm how their access logs worked. She needed to know if the log could be altered or wiped. The customer service agent explained policies, and Amaka asked the questions that sounded boring but were not. Whether log entries had timestamps tied to the safe's internal clock, whether remote resets were possible, whether there was any feature that could show multiple failed attempts before the successful entry. She took notes. The answers gave her a small comfort. The log was not a flimsy story. It was a record designed to stand up to scrutiny. If Obi tried to claim it was a mistake or a glitch, she would have technical responses ready. She was not chasing suspicion anymore. She was building a case. Then she did something that felt strange but necessary. She walked to the estate gate and asked for security footage. Not from inside her bedroom, there were no cameras there, but from the compound entrance and driveway. If Obi left the house with a bag at an odd hour, if a car arrived late at night, if anything unusual happened around the time the safe was opened, it could help paint a complete picture. The security guard hesitated at first, then recognized her seriousness and promised to cooperate once she had formal backing. Amaka did not argue. She understood procedure. She simply noted the guard's name, the time of the conversation, and the shift schedule. The more she collected, the less Obi's story, whatever it was going to be, would have room to breathe. Amaka did not handle the jeweler through the phone alone. Later that day, she drove there herself, sunglasses on, face steady, posture controlled. She walked into the shop like a woman who belonged there, because she did. The jeweler's staff knew her name. They knew her taste. They knew which pieces were hers even before she spoke. That familiarity made the moment heavier, because it meant there was no chance this was a mistake. The jeweler greeted her with a cautious politeness, the kind people use when they sense trouble and want no part of it. Amaka asked to speak privately. When they sat down, she did not begin with drama. She began with a question. I need copies of every document tied to the valuation you did for Obi. Her voice was calm enough to make the request sound routine, but her eyes were not. The jeweler hesitated. The same pause she had heard on the phone, only worse in person. He explained carefully that Obi came in with urgency, claiming the pieces belonged to his household, and he needed a quick valuation for investment. Amaka asked whether Obi provided receipts or certificates. He admitted he did not. He only provided the jewelry. That detail mattered. It meant Obi did not just steal the jewelry. He also relied on the belief that being a husband would be enough to convert stolen property into money. Amaka asked what happened next. The jeweler explained the pieces had been listed for valuation and potential resale. Some inquiries had already been made. A buyer had even asked for the diamond studs. Amaka listened without blinking, even as her stomach tightened. Then she asked for one more thing. The timestamps, the staff names who interacted with Obi, any CCTV from the shop entrance that captured him bringing in the jewelry. When she left the shop, she sat in her car and finally allowed herself to tremble. Not loudly, not theatrically, just the small, uncontrollable shaking of someone whose life has split into before and after. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles paled, then forced herself to breathe slowly. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend asking a harmless question about lunch plans. Amaka stared at it for a long time before putting the phone face down. She was no longer moving through normal life. She was moving toward a confrontation that would explode in public, with witnesses, cameras, and consequences. And she knew something else now too, something that did not comfort her at all. Obi had not only betrayed her, he had made other people part of it. And those people were already preparing to defend themselves. By evening, Amaka tried to call Obi, not because she wanted explanations, but because she needed to measure his response. The first call rang out. The second went straight to voicemail. By the third attempt, the line disconnected immediately. She stared at her phone, not surprised, but deeply aware of what the silence meant. Obi was not unreachable by accident. He had chosen to disappear. That choice hardened something inside her. Men who planned weddings in secret did not panic easily. They prepared exits. Obi had cut communication because he believed he was already beyond her reach, already standing on the other side of a door he assumed she could not open. She checked their shared accounts again and noticed subtle movements, small withdrawals, a rush transfer, expenses labeled vaguely. Nothing dramatic, but enough to confirm activity. Obi was active somewhere, just not with her. Amaka documented each transaction carefully, noting times and descriptions. She did not send messages asking where he was. She did not leave voice notes full of confusion or anger. Instead, she sent one short text, "Call me when you can." It was neutral, non-accusatory, and deliberately non-urgent. When he did not reply, she archived the conversation. She would not chase a man who had already chosen concealment. That night, she slept lightly, waking often, her mind replaying facts instead of emotions. Each time she woke, she reminded herself of the order of things. Evidence first, confrontation later. The silence from Obi was not a weakness in her plan. It was confirmation that she was right. If he had believed he could explain his way out, he would have tried. Instead, he had vanished into a carefully arranged lie, confident that the truth would arrive too late to matter. Amaka turned her face toward the wall and stared into the dark, already knowing that tomorrow would be decisive, not because she would scream or beg, but because she would act. In the early hours of the morning, Amaka returned to the laptop. She did not rush. She made tea, sat properly, and opened folders one by one, as if she were working in an office. Obi had always been careless with logistics. He believed secrecy lived in silence, not in systems. That assumption betrayed him. Flight confirmations appeared first, tickets purchased under his name, departure and return dates that contradicted every word he had spoken before leaving. Hotel bookings followed. Then venue emails saved without password protection. Amaka read them all slowly, absorbing not just the information, but the tone. There was excitement in the language, urgency, confidence. Obi was not hiding in shame. He was celebrating. The venue emails were explicit. A private garden estate. Security arranged. A small guest list. Payment schedules broken into deposits. Amaka cross-checked dates. Everything aligned. The wedding was scheduled for the next morning. Less than 24 hours away. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, feeling the weight of time pressed down on her chest. There was no room left for hesitation. If she waited, the marriage would happen. If the marriage happened, the legal terrain would change. Obi would have crossed a line that could not be uncrossed without greater damage. That realization sharpened her focus rather than overwhelming her. She scrolled further and found what she had not expected to feel relief about. Celeste's name. Seeing it written plainly, bride, Celeste A, ended all remaining doubt. This was not rumor, not assumption, not jealousy. It was fact. Amaka saved every file to her secure drive and emailed copies to herself. She printed the most important pages and placed them neatly in the same folder as her jewelry documents. Then she closed the laptop and stood up, her body steady, her breathing controlled. The time for discovery was over. What remained was response. Amaka did not go to the venue immediately. Instead, she made one final confirmation call to a number listed in the venue email signature. She introduced herself calmly, using her full name, and asked a simple question, whether a private event was scheduled for the next morning under Obi's name. The woman on the other end hesitated, then confirmed. Amaka asked no follow-up questions. She thanked her and ended the call. That was enough. The line between suspicion and certainty had vanished completely. Everything now pointed in one direction, and there was no time left to look away. She spent the rest of the day preparing, not emotionally, but practically. She visited her lawyer's office and laid everything on the table. The missing jewelry, the safe log, the jeweler's documents, the wedding evidence. The lawyer listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and nodded slowly. A theft report was drafted. Statements were written. Amaka signed where necessary without hesitation. She did not ask whether Obi would be arrested immediately. She did not ask how he would explain himself. Those questions belonged to him now, not to her. What mattered was that the law was engaged before the confrontation, not after. By evening, Amaka returned home and packed a small bag, not to run, but to be ready. She chose her clothes for the next day with care. Nothing dramatic, nothing fragile, nothing that could be easily torn. She did not dress for revenge. She dressed for endurance. As she stood in front of the mirror that night, she studied her reflection carefully. The woman looking back at her was tired, but clear-eyed. Whatever happened at that wedding would be loud, chaotic, and public. But Amaka already knew something no one else did yet. She would not be the one losing control. Amaka arrived at her lawyer's office just after midday, carrying a folder that had grown heavier with every hour, not in weight, but in consequence. She did not dramatize her entrance or rush her words. She sat, placed the folder on the table, and opened it section by section, explaining only what was necessary and nothing more. The lawyer listened in silence as Amaka walked him through the timeline. The missing jewelry, the selective nature of the theft, the safe access log, the jeweler's valuation records, and finally the wedding scheduled for the next morning. There were no raised eyebrows, no gasps, no emotional reactions. Just the quiet clicking of a pen and the occasional pause to ask for clarification. When Amaka finished, the room stayed silent for a long moment, heavy with the understanding that this was no domestic misunderstanding. This was theft. Planned. Documented. The lawyer explained the process carefully, what could be done immediately, and what would take time. A formal report would need to be filed before any confrontation. Evidence had to be logged, timestamps verified, and statements recorded while facts were still fresh. Amaka agreed without hesitation. She had not come for reassurance. She had come for action. The theft report was drafted, each line precise, unemotional, and factual. Amaka read it twice before signing, correcting a date here, clarifying a description there. When she signed her name at the bottom, she felt no relief, only finality. A door had closed quietly behind her, and there was no turning back. Before she left, the lawyer asked the question everyone eventually asks, what outcome she wanted. Amaka did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, steady on her lap, and then back up. I want the marriage stopped, she said simply. And I want the truth on record. The lawyer nodded. He explained that confronting Obi privately could complicate things, lead to denials, counterclaims, or destruction of evidence. Amaka already knew this. That was why she had chosen law before confrontation. By the time she walked out of the office, copies of her documents were already being processed. The law was no longer something she planned to invoke. It was already moving. On her way home, Amaka considered every alternative carefully. She could call Obi one last time. She could meet him quietly. She could demand explanations behind closed doors and walk away without witnesses. The options were there, but each came with consequences she was unwilling to accept. A private confrontation would not stop the wedding if Obi chose to proceed anyway. A quiet settlement would allow lies to survive, and silence would protect everyone except her. By the time she parked in her driveway, the decision had already settled fully in her chest. If the marriage was happening in public, then the truth would meet it there openly, clearly, without shouting. That evening, she rehearsed nothing. She did not practice speeches or imagine insults. She read through her documents again, ensuring everything was in order, everything accessible. She arranged the folder so that the most important evidence sat on top, ready to be handed over without fumbling. She charged her phone, set alarms, and placed her car keys by the door. There was no rage driving her actions now, only resolve. Rage would come later, maybe, when the dust had settled. But tomorrow required clarity, not fury. As night deepened, Amaka allowed herself one moment of honesty. She sat alone in the living room and acknowledged what she was about to lose. Not just a husband, but the version of her life she had believed in. The shared plans. The assumed future. She did not romanticize it. She did not soften it. She simply let the truth exist. When she finally went to bed, sleep came in fragments, but it came. And when she woke before dawn, she did not feel afraid. She felt ready. The venue was already alive when Amaka arrived. Cars lined the driveway, and soft music floated into the morning air. Guests were stepping out in careful outfits, adjusting shoes, greeting one another with smiles that knew nothing of what was about to happen. Amaka parked at a distance and sat in her car for a moment, watching. She noticed how ordinary everything looked, how easy it would have been for this wedding to pass, as just another celebration if the truth had stayed hidden. She picked up her folder, locked the car, and walked toward the entrance without hesitation. Inside, the ceremony had begun. Amaka did not interrupt immediately. She stood at the back, unseen, listening to words about love and commitment that rang hollow now that she knew their cost. Obi stood at the front, relaxed, confident, unaware that the structure he had built on stolen ground was already collapsing. Celeste stood beside him, radiant, surrounded by relatives who looked proud and protective. Amaka watched it all with a strange calm, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had already done its worst the night before. What remained was purpose. When the officiant reached the moment that asked for objections, Amaka stepped forward. Not rushed, not shaking, not loud. Heads turned. Whispers spread. She spoke clearly, identifying herself, stating her relationship to Obi, and explaining, briefly, factually, that the wedding was being funded with stolen property. She did not insult. She did not accuse emotionally. She offered proof. The shift in the room was immediate. Smiles faded. Murmurs grew louder. And as Amaka stood there, documents in hand, she knew with certainty that whatever happened next, chaos, anger, confrontation, would not be something she had lost control of. It would be something she had walked into fully prepared. For a few seconds after Amaka identified herself, the garden seemed to forget how to breathe. The officiant lowered his book slowly, as if unsure whether the words inside it still mattered. Guests twisted in their seats, some standing, some frozen halfway, trying to match the woman speaking calmly at the aisle with the life-altering statement she had just made. Obi's face shifted through disbelief, confusion, and finally recognition, his mouth opening as if to speak before closing again. Amaka did not wait for permission. She spoke with measured clarity, introducing herself not as an angry intruder, but as Obi's lawful wife, married under the law, still legally bound, still very much present. Her voice carried without effort, not loud, but firm enough to cut through the murmurs, spreading like wildfire across the rows of guests. She explained, carefully and without embellishment, that certain items of her personal property, luxury jewelry clearly documented and insured in her name, had been removed from her home without consent and sold or listed for sale to finance the wedding taking place before them. As she spoke, she opened her folder and held it up, not theatrically, but visibly, allowing the nearest guests to see receipts, valuation papers, and printed records. She did not accuse Celeste directly. She did not insult anyone's character. She stated facts, one after another, allowing them to pile up with their own weight. Each sentence landed harder than the last, not because of how it was said, but because of how undeniable it was. The officiant attempted to speak, to regain control of the ceremony, but the room was already slipping beyond him. Obi finally found his voice, calling Amaka's name, asking her to stop, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. Amaka turned to him briefly, not with anger, but with a look that made it clear explanations were no longer relevant. She told him calmly that the matter had already been reported and that authorities had been notified. That single sentence changed the atmosphere completely. This was no longer a marital dispute. It was a legal one, and everyone in attendance felt it at once. The murmurs grew louder, sharper, less controlled. Celeste's relatives reacted first, not with questions, but with outrage. A woman in the front row stood abruptly, accusing Amaka of jealousy, of bitterness, of trying to sabotage happiness. Another man shouted that family matters should be handled privately. Amaka did not respond to them. She kept her attention on the officiant and the security personnel stationed discreetly near the edges of the venue. She repeated calmly that she was not there to argue or disrupt, only to prevent the continuation of a ceremony funded by stolen property and entered into under false pretenses. Her restraint infuriated them more than shouting ever could have. Celeste finally spoke, her voice shaking, insisting she knew nothing about any theft, that Obi had told her the jewelry belonged to him, that everything was legitimate. Amaka listened without interruption. When Celeste finished, Amaka responded once, and only once, by stating that knowledge or ignorance would be determined by investigation, not by declarations at the altar. She then produced the safe access log, pointing out the date and time, and the jeweler's valuation records bearing Obi's name. The room shifted again, this time more violently. Phones were fully raised now. Whispers turned into audible gasps. Someone at the back muttered that the wedding should be stopped immediately. Obi stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch Amaka's arm, but she stepped back before his hand could reach her. That movement, small, controlled, deliberate, triggered something raw in Celeste's family. Voices overlapped. Accusations escalated. Someone accused Amaka of trying to destroy a young woman's future. Another accused her of lying. The tension cracked under its own pressure, and the ceremony, such as it was, disintegrated into noise. Through it all, Amaka stood still, her documents pressed lightly against her side, her expression unchanged. She had not come to win an argument. She had come to establish truth. And truth, once spoken, no longer needed her to defend it. The first shove came from behind. Amaka felt it before she saw it, a sudden force against her shoulder that sent her stumbling forward. She caught herself before falling, turning just in time to see one of Celeste's relatives advancing again, face twisted with rage. Words became screams. Hands grabbed. Someone struck at Amaka's arm, knocking the folder from her grasp. Papers scattered across the ground, white sheets fluttering like startled birds. The restraint that had held the room together finally snapped. Guests rushed forward, some trying to intervene, others shouting, others simply recording everything with shaking phones. Amaka did not fight back. She raised her hands instinctively, backing away as another woman lunged at her, clawing at her dress, screaming accusations that barely formed words. The chaos intensified within seconds. Chairs overturned. The officiant retreated entirely. Obi shouted for everyone to stop, his voice cracking, his authority non-existent. Celeste cried out, half in shock, half in panic, as her relatives surged forward, fully convinced now that Amaka was the enemy they needed to eliminate, not a woman standing on the side of the law. Security moved indecisively. Trained arms separated bodies, restraining those who continued to swing and shout. Amaka was pulled aside immediately, shielded as the fight spread briefly before being contained. The garden echoed with screams, curses, and the sharp commands of security personnel. By the time the last person was restrained, the venue no longer resembled a wedding at all. It was disorderly, torn apart, and silent in the stunned aftermath. Amaka stood off to one side, her dress creased, her arm marked, her expression steady. The noise had finally arrived, just as she knew it would. And it had come from everyone else. The venue gates were shut within minutes, the soft garden music long silenced, replaced by clipped instructions and the unmistakable authority of trained security personnel. What had begun as a ceremony had fully transformed into a controlled lockdown. Guests who had not been involved in the altercation were directed to remain seated or move slowly toward designated areas, their earlier excitement replaced with stunned compliance. Those who had thrown punches, shoved bodies, or screamed threats were restrained firmly, wrists secured, movements limited. Celeste's relatives protested loudly, insisting they were the ones wronged, but their voices carried no weight anymore. The moment violence erupted, the narrative changed. This was no longer about infidelity or stolen jewelry. It was about public disorder and assault. Amaka was escorted a short distance away, not as a suspect, but as a protected party. A security officer asked her if she was injured. She answered calmly, indicating minor scratches, nothing requiring immediate medical attention. Her composure stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding behind her, where Celeste sobbed openly, one relative shouting incoherently while another struggled against restraint. Obi stood immobilized at the center of it all, his earlier confidence completely erased, his wedding jacket torn, his expression vacant, as if his mind could not keep pace with the consequences catching up to him. Each time he looked toward Amaka, his mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound followed. The moment for words had passed. As security maintained control, the venue manager contacted law enforcement. The call was brief and factual. There was no exaggeration, no emotional appeal, just a report of a physical altercation during a private event involving multiple parties. Within moments, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Guests who had arrived to witness vows now sat rigid, aware that they were about to become witnesses of a very different kind. Amaka stood quietly, her documents retrieved and returned to her by a security officer who had gathered the scattered pages. She thanked him softly, reorganized the folder with careful hands, and waited. Everything from this point forward would belong to procedure. The police arrived with efficiency that left no room for argument. Officers spread out, assessing the scene, separating those involved, and taking initial statements. The questions were direct and unemotional. Who initiated physical contact? Who was assaulted? Who attempted to intervene? Amaka was among the first to be approached. She identified herself, presented her documents, and explained, briefly, why she had been there. Her account was consistent, supported by paperwork already time-stamped and verifiable. An officer reviewed the theft report number she provided and confirmed it through his radio. The exchange was professional, almost impersonal. There were no raised voices, no dramatics. Just facts aligning cleanly. Celeste and her relatives told a different story, each version layered with outrage and accusation, but the inconsistencies were immediate. One claimed Amaka attacked first. Another claimed she had provoked them verbally. A third insisted the entire confrontation was fabricated to embarrass them. Phones held by guests told a quieter, more accurate story. Videos capturing the moment Amaka was shoved, the escalation, the sudden violence. Officers reviewed clips briefly, nodding without comment. Obi attempted to intervene, insisting everything was a misunderstanding, pleading that the wedding be allowed to continue. The officer, listening, did not respond. Weddings did not continue after assaults. There was no such protocol. After nearly an hour of statements and evidence review, decisions were made. Amaka was informed she was free to leave, her role clearly established as complainant, not aggressor. She was advised on next steps and given contact details for follow-up. Celeste, Obi, and the relatives directly involved in the altercation were informed they would be taken in for further questioning and possible charges. The announcement landed heavily. Celeste cried openly now, her earlier defiance gone. One of her relatives fell silent entirely. Obi's shoulders sagged, his last illusion of control collapsing. As they were led away, the cameras that had once been raised in excitement now recorded something else entirely, the quiet dismantling of a lie. Amaka walked out of the venue without ceremony. No one applauded. No one stopped her. The air outside felt cooler, steadier, as if the world itself had exhaled. She sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, allowing her body to catch up with the weight of what had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of tension she had been carrying for days. She did not cry. There would be time for that later, in private, where it belonged. For now, she drove home carefully, aware that the road ahead had shifted, but not disappeared. Hours later, the calls began. First from unknown numbers she ignored. Then from Obi. She answered the third call, not out of compassion, but to draw a clear line. His voice broke immediately, apologies tumbling over one another, promises forming and collapsing before they were finished. He said he never meant for things to go that far. He said he could explain. He said Celeste meant nothing compared to what they had built. Amaka listened until he ran out of words, then told him calmly that explanations were no longer hers to receive. She ended the call without anger and blocked the number. By the next day, messages came from Celeste's family as well, pleading, apologizing, asking her to show mercy, to withdraw complaints, to help reduce the consequences. They framed it as kindness, as womanhood, as grace. Amaka read none of it. She forwarded every message to her lawyer and placed her phone face down. Mercy, she understood, was not the same as interference. Justice did not need her emotions to proceed. It only needed the truth. And the truth had already been spoken, clearly, publicly. And at the exact moment, it could no longer be undone. Detention stripped everything down to reality. Obi no longer sounded like a groom or a confident husband. He sounded like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. From the holding facility, he called repeatedly through intermediaries, his cousin and old family friend, even a church elder, each one delivering the same message in different words. He is sorry, he is ashamed, he is begging. When Amaka finally agreed to speak to him through her lawyer's line, his voice cracked before he could finish a sentence. He admitted the theft without excuses now, confessed that panic and desire had driven him, that he believed he could fix things later. He asked her to withdraw the report, to help him avoid prosecution, to remember their years together. Amaka listened without interrupting, not because his words moved her, but because she needed to hear the full shape of his collapse to be sure she would not doubt herself later. The pleas multiplied. Celeste's relatives joined in, sending messages heavy with desperation and poorly concealed fear. They apologized for the violence, blamed stress, blamed emotions, blamed the shock of the moment. They asked Amaka to speak to the police, to clarify things, to soften the matter. Some tried a different approach, invoking culture, marriage, forgiveness, even God. Others warned quietly about how public the case had become, how damaging it would be for everyone if it continued. None of them spoke about the theft as a crime. They spoke about consequences as inconveniences. That difference mattered to Amaka more than any insult could have. Obi tried again, this time asking for forgiveness, not as a husband, but as a man facing judgment. He promised change, promised repentance, promised to end things with Celeste forever. He begged her to think of mercy as strength. Amaka responded only once, through her lawyer, with a statement that left no room for negotiation. This matter is no longer personal. It is legal. I will not interfere. When Obi heard that, something in him broke audibly. The line went silent, and the call ended without farewell. For the first time since the wedding disaster, Amaka felt something close to peace, not satisfaction, not joy, but certainty. The case moved forward without Amaka's involvement beyond what was required. She attended no dramatic hearings, gave no interviews, and made no public statements. Her role was already complete. Evidence spoke where she did not need to. Obi faced charges related to theft and fraud. Celeste and her relatives faced charges connected to assault and public disorder. The wedding that had been planned in secrecy became a public record for entirely different reasons. Gossip followed, then faded, as gossip always does. What remained were files, rulings, and consequences that did not care about sentiment. Amaka reclaimed what could be reclaimed. Some of her jewelry was returned. Some had already moved beyond recovery and was compensated through legal processes. She closed joint accounts, changed locks, and filed the final divorce papers without ceremony. Friends expected bitterness, maybe a dramatic transformation, maybe visible anger. What they saw instead was distance. Amaka did not need to punish Obi personally. The law had done what it was meant to do. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not mandatory for healing. Sometimes, closure came from drawing a line, so clear it could never be crossed again. Months later, as her life settled into a new rhythm, Amaka stood once more before her jewelry box, not to admire its contents, but to close it gently and place it back where it belonged. The box no longer symbolized luxury or marriage or status. It symbolized clarity. She had walked into chaos without screaming, stood inside violence without striking back, and walked away without begging for peace. Mercy had been requested. Justice had answered instead. And Amaka, for the first time in a long while, slept without waking to questions she could not answer. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.